Welcome back everyone to the second part of my monk guide. I'm Frizz, and today we're going to be talking about every single monk feat currently released in Pathfinder 2e. As you can see, this is quite the long video, so go ahead and get something to drink and get a snack or something, since I'm going to be talking for a long time today, and yeah, you might as well be refreshed while watching this. If you're interested in the rest of the monk class, then part 1 of this guide has that information for you, so if you would like to see it, then you can just go and check on that. Without further ado, let's start talking about feats, because we're going to be here for a long time, so we might as well find ways to be here for a little bit less time. Starting off, let's talk about the crane stance feat. Monks have a lot of different stances, so I'm just going to be mentioning the monk stance 101 here. All stances are entered by spending a single action whenever you meet the prerequisites, and you remain in them for as long as you meet the requirements and are not knocked unconscious. It's pretty self-explanatory. Also, most monk stances give access to a particular type of unarmed attack, and these unarmed attacks are generally insanely good because they have a ton of traits and they're basically equivalent to martial or advanced weapons, which is very, very good. Crane stance itself is nice and simple, in that it predominantly focuses on defense, and it also gives some nice mobility upgrades as well. Well, in Crane Stance you get a constant +1 circumstance bonus to AC without having to spend any additional actions, and you can only make Crane Wing unarmed attacks, which are 1d6 bludgeoning attacks that are in the Brawling group with the Agile, Finesse, Non-Lethal, and Unarmed traits. Basically, these are just normal unarmed attacks, but you can't try and use other weird strikes or all that. You have to use Crane Wing attacks. Additionally, while in Crane Stance, you can reduce the DC for high jumps and long jumps by 5, and you can leap an additional 5 feet further horizontally and 2 feet higher vertically. This is pretty good, and it can stack with a bunch of other effects to make you jump really, really far. The real draw of this stance, though, in my mind, is the constant +1 bonus to AC without having to use further actions. It's not as good as a circumstance bonus to your AC from raising a shield, but raising a shield requires using an action every turn to actually get that bonus, where Crane Stance is just one action and you're good for the rest of the fight. Dragon Stance is another stance that can only be used while you're unarmored, but this time it's focused around dealing large amounts of damage and is really, really great for strength monks. Now you can make Dragon Tail attacks, which are 1d10 brawling weapons that deal bludgeoning damage. They have the backswing, non-lethal, and unarmed traits, meaning that you have to use strength on your attack rolls, which means that this is probably best for strength monks, and also that it doesn't have the agile trait, which means that you might be better to follow this up with, normal unarmed attacks or follow-up attacks to reduce the multiple attack penalty. The second benefit of the Dragon Stance is that you can ignore the first square of difficult terrain whenever you stride. This might not come up all too often, but it can be pretty useful for allowing you to move effectively 5 feet further whenever you stride. Gorilla Stance is one of the weirdest monk stances, as it doesn't actually require you to be unarmored. This makes it really great for other classes to pick up from a monk multiclass archetype, as now they can use a monk stance while still wearing, heavy armor. It's a really interesting idea, but this doesn't mean that it's bad for normal monks. While in this stance, you lower your stance kinda low to the ground and kinda walk like a gorilla, but you can only make Gorilla Slam unarmed attacks. These deal 1d8 bludgeoning damage are in the Brawling group. Also, since every single unarmed attack is in the Brawling group, I'm just not going to mention that from now on. I've got to save my voice somewhere. In addition to all of that, Gorilla Slam attacks have the backswing, forceful, grapple, non-lethal, and unarmed traits, making the stance pretty fantastic for a strength-based monk. Also, while you're in this stance, you get a +2 circumstance bonus on athletics checks to climb, and if you get a success, then you get a critical success instead. Being able to climb better is great and can really make for some really weird plans in combat where you can climb around all over the place, especially with how fast monks can get. Overall, it's a really nice stance. The Key Rush feat gives access to the Key Rush focus spell, in addition to giving you key spells if you didn't already have them. Also, if you didn't have one already, then you get a focus point. Key Rush allows for you to move really, really fast as a single action. It's, a single action verbal spell, meaning it doesn't provoke attacks of opportunity, where it allows you to stride 2 times, step 2 times, or a combination of the both, so step then stride or stride then step. Also, Due to how fast you're moving, you become concealed until the start of your next turn, due to just you going really, really fast. Key Rush is pretty nice for defense, but it really shines with helping you get into position faster than basically any other class in the game possibly can. You can just, run 60 feet at level 3 for one action, which is really crazy. Key Strike allows for you to cast the Key Strike focus spell, which is a great way to increase your damage about once a fight. For a single action, you make an unarmed strike or flurry of blows, with a +1 status bonus on your attack rolls, so if it's a flurry of blows, it's on both. Additionally, every single time that you hit, you deal an additional 1d6 damage. Every time that you cast this spell, you can choose to either deal force damage, lawful damage, negative damage, or positive damage. But generally, unless you're fighting something with weakness or resistances that you can target with those damage types, I generally recommend just to pick force damage every time, as basically nothing in the game resists force damage. So if you're fighting something that's weak to positive damage, use positive damage, but otherwise just use force. Every 4 levels that this spell gets heightened, the extra damage increases by 6, which is fantastic. Overall, Key Strike is a great boost to both your accuracy and damage, and can really help swing a fight in your favor if you use it at an opportune moment. Also, if you didn't have a focus pull already, you get one. The Monastic Archer stance sets up for a very unique way to play a monk, that of being a ranged damage dealer. Once you take this feat, you become trained in longbows, shortbows, and any monks with the bow trait. Just so you know, there are no bows with the monk trait. So, as of currently of writing this video, then that doesn't matter, and it's just future-proofing for whenever Paizo does eventually release bows with the monk trait. Whenever your proficiency with any weapons increase, so does your proficiency with bows. Basically, whatever your accuracy is with a normal weapon, that's your attack proficiency with a bow. Whenever you're wielding a bow, you can now use an action to enter this stance, and whenever you're in this stance, you can now use strikes from longbows, shortbows, and any hypothetical bows with the monk trait to flurry of blows and use any other abilities that require unarmed attacks, so long as they're within the first half of your range increment with that weapon. This is a really interesting way to play a monk, and is a fun way to play a hyper-mobile ranged striker. There are a couple of other feats later on that help out this playstyle a lot that I will be getting into a bit later. Monastic weaponry is for monks that want to be able to use weapons to do their cool tricks instead of their bodies. You get access to all the uncommon weapons with the monk trait, and become trained in simple and martial monk weapons. And as you level up, your proficiency increases with them just like your other proficiencies. Also, you can use weapons that have the monk trait for other monk feats or abilities that normally require unarmed attacks, although not if they call for a specific unarmed attack. Basically, you can use Psi to flurry of blows, but you can't use it whenever you're in a crane stance, because when you're in crane stance, the only strikes you can make are crane wing attacks. Mountain stance is yet another really unique monk stance that sets up for a weird playstyle, though this time it's unique in how it allows for a monk to rely on dexterity not at all when it comes to their AC. To enter Mountain Stance, which is a style made by dwarven monks, you have to be unarmored and touching the ground, meaning that if you ever are not touching the ground, you leave this stance. Once you're in it, you can now only make Falling Stone unarmed attacks. They deal 1d8 bludgeoning damage and have the forceful, non-lethal, and unarmed traits. This is alright so far, but the real benefit is the bonus to your AC. While you're in Mountain Stance, you get a +4 item bonus to your AC and a +2 circumstance bonus to any defenses against being shoved or being tripped. The downside of this is they have a dexterity modifier of 0 to your AC, and your speeds are reduced by 5 feet. Thankfully, this item bonus to AC stacks with armor potency runes, mage armor, and bracers of armor. The playstyle of a Mountain Stance monk is pretty different from basically any other monk, since it's all about being super defensive and just shields up, basically. Also, as you level up, you can later get feats that increase the dexterity cap of this stance, meaning that eventually this stance is the route to the highest AC a monk can achieve, as you can basically get heavy armor on a monk. The Reign of Ember stance is a rare feat, meaning that it might not actually be available at character creation, and because it's a bit of a weird one. Don't worry too much about it though, since there is another level 1 stance feat that is all about fire. But Brain of Embers is still pretty unique and is the most fire-based stance. The stance itself is based around phoenixes in the way that they fight, and while you're in it, you can only make fire talent strikes. These do 1d4 fire damage and have the agile, finesse, fire, non-lethal, and unarmed traits. Additionally, you get a +1 status bonus to your AC and fire resistance equal to half your level. This is a really great defensive stance since it stacks with raising a shield, and it's a great way to get around physical resistances. I will be warning you here, though, that fire is the most common energy type to have resistance to, because there's a ton of different creatures that have resistance to fire, and a ton that also have immunity to fire. So you are going to be running into creatures that you simply cannot hurt with fire talent strikes. Otherwise, it is a very good feat, though, with some really funny upgrades later on. Reflecting Ripple's stance is basically waterbending from Avatar, but with a bit less water. It gives you a bunch of ways to manipulate your opponent's movement and use it to your advantage, and all of your movements leave behind small amounts of water. While in it, you can make flowing wave attacks that deal 1d6 bludgeoning damage that have the agile, disarm, finesse, non-lethal, trip, unarmed, and water traits. These are basically better than normal unarmed attacks in every single way, and the disarm and trip traits can really help you out at succeeding on those maneuvers if you don't have a way to get an item bonus to athletics. The other benefit that you receive from being in this stance is that you get a +1 circumstance bonus to athletics checks to disarm, swim, or trip people. And you also get a +2 circumstance bonus to your reflex DC to avoid being disarmed or tripped yourself. I don't know how likely it is that you're actually going to be wielding a weapon while in this stance to avoid being disarmed, but the trip bonus is pretty great. Basically, this stance is all about combat maneuvers. Also, the stance gets the Divine or Occult trait, and try to make that match your key spell tradition if possible, but I genuinely don't know when this would be important. The Stoked Flame stance is that fire stance that I mentioned earlier, and it's really great for strength monks. While in this stance, you can make flashing strikes unarmed attacks that deal 1d8 slashing damage that have the forceful, non-lethal, sweep, and unarmed traits. Additionally, if you have access to the critical specialization effect for your, brawling attacks, you can instead deal 1d6 persistent fire damage. This is alright, but I feel like the normal critical specialization effect for brawling weapons is a lot better, but we'll be talking about that later on in a bit more detail. The last part of this feat is that while you're in this stance, you can increase your speed by 5 feet, and this bonus stacks with the incredible movement class feature. You're going to be stupidly mobile with this feature, and I really like it. Stumbling Stance is for those out there that want to play a sort of drunken master, deception-based sort of character. You have to be trained to deception to be able to take it, and be unarmored to enter the stance. But once you're in it, it's all about staggering around all over the place, and distracting people from what you're actually trying to do. You get a +1 circumstance bonus to deception checks to feint, and the only strikes you can make are stumbling swings. These have the agile, backstabber, finesse, non-lethal, and arm traits, and deal 1d6 bludgeoning damage. The backstabber trait especially will help out with damage because, this is a feinting-based style, so you're probably going to be fighting people who are flat-footed a lot, so the additional precision damage will be helpful. The other benefit is if someone hits you with a melee attack, they are automatically flat-footed against your next stumbling swing attack made against them before the end of your next turn. So basically, that's free flat-footed, which free flat-footed is very nice. The stumbling stance is really great to build a deception-based monk, and it's just a fun concept of someone who really acts like they have no idea what they're doing and is just basically falling all around the combat, but is actually highly effective. Tiger Stance is nice and simple, and it just focuses on damage and mobility. You can now make Tiger Claw attacks that deal 1d8 slashing damage, and they have the agile, finesse, and unarmed traits. Also, on a critical success, you deal 1d4 persistent bleed damage. Overall, these attacks are, amazing, although the bleed damage will probably become irrelevant in just a couple of levels because 1d4 really isn't all that much. Also, just to put this in perspective at how good this attack is, the only other, normal 1d8 finesse weapon requires 2 hands and is not agile. So this is really crazy. The last benefit of the Tiger Stance is that as long as your speed is at least 20 feet, you can step 10 feet instead of 5, which is really nice, and it allows you to step away from someone, and then now they have to spend an action to approach you. So if you, say, get an attack of opportunity, or the standstill feat later on, and you have reach, you can just whack people as they have to approach you, and it's a really, really fun way to play. Wolf Stance is another very nice and simple feat. You get the ability to make Wolf Jaw unarmed attacks that deal 1d8 piercing damage with the Agile, Backstabber, Finesse, Non-Lethal, and Unarmed traits. Also, while you're flanking someone, they also get the Trip trait. This is nice and simple, although I do wish that the additional benefit that you got was maybe a little bit more useful. Overall, though, it's pretty nice because it is, a 1d8 Finesse and Agile attack, which that itself is amazing. It's not the flashiest stance out there, but it's pretty damn good. We're finally out of level 1 feats, and now let's move on to level 2. Also, we're pretty much done with the stance feats by this point. There's only a couple more left. Finally. Now, level 2. Ancestral Weaponry is a nice and simple upgrade to Monastic Weaponry. You have to have Monastic Weaponry to take it, obviously, and you also have to have a feat that gives access to weapons with an Ancestry trait. Basically, melee weapons that have that Ancestry trait, and either the Agile or Finesse trait, also now gain the Monk trait. Now you can flurry with them all that you want. An Elven Monk flurrying with an Elven Branch Spear is a really scary concept. And it's just a really fun idea, too. While many classes get their critical specialization effects as just a part of leveling up, monks do have to go out of their way to get them with the Brawling Focus feat. Whenever you grab Brawling Focus, you now get the critical specialization effects of unarmed attacks in the Brawling group, and weapons in the Brawling group. Plus, if you have Monastic Weaponry, you get their critical specialization effects as well. The Brawling critical specialization effect is honestly one of the best in the entire game, as it is a Fortitude save that they have to make against their class DC or become slowed 1. Being able to apply slowed 1 just with a chance on every single attack is really, really scary, especially since this doesn't have the incapacitation effect. This is a really great way to make your critical hits super, super scary, because denying their actions is the best strategy you can go for. Crushing Grab is an alright feat at level 2, but it very quickly becomes pretty bad, especially past like level 5 or so. Whenever you successfully grapple a creature, you deal lethal or non-lethal damage equal to your strength modifier to them. The issue that this feat faces is that HP scales way, way faster with level than your strength modifier ever will. So after a certain point, dealing 4 or 5 damage won't mean that much whenever things have like 250 hit points. So unfortunately, this just doesn't scale very well. If this scaled with any, say, striking runes that you got, then this would be better, but as it is, it's just not very good. Dancing Leaf is a great way to make people watching you move just be confused as you start being able to float around like a leaf on the breeze and just generally ignore laws of physics. Not literally though, as it's way too soon to have access to actual flight, but it helps with falling damage and jumping quite a lot. Whenever you leap or succeed at a high jump or long jump, you increase the distance by 5 feet. Also, whenever you are falling from somewhere, you don't count the distance wherever you were adjacent to a wall whenever you're calculating falling damage. Being able to leap 7 feet into the air without a check is something impossible for most people for a long time. And let's be honest, how often are you falling from a great height and are not next to a wall or a cliff face? Really, you're almost always next to something that you can grab onto. This is a nice boost to mobility, and it can really help you out if you just want to kind of leave your party in the dust and like jump off a cliff and say, "Oh, what? Come on, guys. Why don't you follow me?" And watch them be a little bit incredulous about jumping off a 300-foot cliff. It's just a very fun feat with a lot of, fun interactions for mobility, and mobility is one of the things that monks do best. Elemental Fist is an upgrade to Keystrike and allows for you to have a bit more options whenever you cast the focus spell. Now, you can choose electricity, bludgeoning, fire, or cold damage in addition to force, lawful, positive, and negative, and of course these effects are now tied to different elements. These are pretty alright options, but running into creatures with elemental weaknesses isn't all that common, and running into creatures with elemental resistances is fairly common, so I don't actually know if this feat is particularly good. It's taking a feat and then hoping that you're going to be running into something with elemental weaknesses, because otherwise you should just be doing force damage, because nothing is resistant to force damage. It's still a really fun feat though, so feel free to take it if it matches your character concept that you have in mind. The shooting star stance is pretty similar to the monastic archery stance, in that it allows for you to use abilities that normally require unarmed attacks with a shuriken, so you can do them at range. The main reason that you would want this is because shuriken are actually the only thrown weapons in the entire game with the reload 0 trait, meaning that they can be drawn and used in the same action. So normally, if a thrown weapon, you have to, you know, spend an action to draw it, and then you throw it. Or you get quick draw, and you can do that as one action. But shuriken, you can flurry of blows with them now, and you can just do that. This is pretty useful, and it means that you don't have to lug around a bow everywhere. And generally, yeah, shuriken might be lower damage dice than most bows, but they are thrown weapons, meaning that they get your full strength modifier to damage, unlike half of that bows normally get. Plus, monastic archery is locked into a smaller range, that being half of the first range increment, where as long as you can hit something with a shuriken, you can still flurry someone from 120 feet away. You won't be very accurate at that distance, but you technically still can. So, if you're trying to play a ranged monk, this or the monastic archery stance are the best options. Stunning Fist, the level 2 feat that makes it hard to justify getting any other level 2 feat. Seriously, Stunning Fist is that good. Whenever you target the same creature twice, with Flurry of Blows, and at least one attack hits, then they have to make a Fortitude save against your class DC. If they fail, then they're stunned 1, losing an action and not being able to make any reactions. If they critically fail, then they're now stunned 3, losing a whole turn. While the save does have the incapacitation trait, which means that higher level creatures aren't going to be getting stunned very often, this is insanely good. Part of the reason why the incapacitation trait is a bummer for a lot of abilities is because often it's attached to abilities that can only be used a couple of times a day, like, say, spells that you have to prepare, or just once per day abilities. Flurry of Blows is not one of those, and is probably going to be used every single turn of every combat that you're in, meaning they're going to have to make this save a hell of a lot, and stunned is one of the most powerful conditions to apply to people in the entire game. This is absolutely amazing and makes pretty much all of your Flurry of Blows terrifying to get hit by. I'll say it again, and, I'm going to be saying it again in the future, certainly. Denying enemy actions is almost always the most effective strategy in the entire system. Cobra Stance is yet another stance feat, but this time it's all about poison. While in this stance, the only strikes that you can make are Cobra Fang attacks that deal 1d4 bludgeoning damage, and have the Agile, Deadly D10, Finesse non-lethal poison, and unarmed traits. The traits on Cobra Fang strikes are honestly pretty dang amazing, as Deadly D10 can deal a lot of extra damage. If you manage to critically hit someone, then you're going to be doing very, very large amounts of damage compared to your normal attacks. The downside, though, is that poison is a very common type of damage for creatures to have resistance or immunity to, so it might not be always a super reliable way to deal damage. As an example, a ton of undead are immune to poison due to them, already being dead and not really having a circulatory system. So, you're going to be running into undead a lot, so that's already a common creature type that you're not going to be able to damage with this. The second benefit of Cobra Stance is amazing, though, since you get a constant +1 circumstance bonus to Fortitude saves and to your Fortitude DC, in addition to also getting poison resistance equal to half your level. This is really, really good, because, in general, being better at Fortitude saves is better than being worse at Fortitude saves. And it's also a well-timed example of how a lot of different types of creatures get poison resistance, and that includes you. Deflect Arrow is a pretty basic defensive reaction with fairly limited scope, but it's great to have whenever you can actually use it. You have to be targeted by a physical ranged attack, and you have to be aware of it, and not flat-footed to it, and you have to have a hand free. Thankfully, since you're a monk, you're almost certainly going to have a hand free because, you're a monk, you're not going to be all that likely to be carrying weapons. Once you use the reaction, then you get a +4 circumstance bonus to your AC against the triggering attack. If the attack misses, then that means that you batted it out of the air like the joke that it was. Unfortunately, you can't use this against, you know, unusually large projectiles like boulders or ballista bolts, but your gym might actually allow you to do that if you get enlarged. So just ask them. Say, hey, if I get enlarged some large size or even larger, then can I now try and bat those projectiles out of the air now that I'm larger? Despite how this might not be useful in every single fight, this is insanely good as a +4 circumstance bonus to your AC is pretty absurd and will greatly reduce your chance of getting hit, and even more reduce the chance of getting critically hit. Flurry of Maneuvers is pretty simple and requires that you're an expert in athletics. Whenever you use Flurry of Blows, you can replace one or both of the attacks with a grapple, shove, or trip. This makes the monk action economy even more busted than it already was, and grappling someone then knocking them prone is a great way to take their ego down a notch. Basically just chokeslam someone. Keep in mind though that this does not help with your multiple attack penalty though, so if you choose to use a maneuver on the second attack in a flurry of blows, then it will be at a -5 penalty. So just understand that if you do it second, then it will have a lower chance of success. Flying Kick is a little bit of a situational feat that actually scales pretty well with athletics. For 2 actions, you make a leap or attempt a high jump or long jump. At the end of the jump, if you're next to someone, then you can immediately hit them with an unarmed attack, even if they are mid-air. You then immediately fall if you're in the air, but if the distance that you fall is no more than the height of your jump, then you don't take falling damage. This might not seem all that strong initially, since if the foe is on the ground, you can just run up to them and then punch them with a flurry of blows for the same amount of actions, but it is useful for trying to get people who are up in the air. The issue here, though, is that generally, high jumps and leaps can't go all that far up into the air, so it might not seem like a very viable option to get someone who's flying. But with just a couple of feats like Powerful Leap and Dancing Leaf and the Crane Stance feat, then that can really improve your vertical height that you can get whenever you jump. Plus, if you ever get the 15th level Cloud Leap skill feat, it will allow you to jump 40 feet into the air, like minimum, to just go up there and kick someone in the face. A lot of other martial classes can get similar ways to deal with flying enemies. Those don't generally become available until after level 10, not at just level 4. Being able to deal with flying enemies is a must for martial characters, and while this isn't nearly as good as being able to fly, it is still a nice stopgap before flight becomes available. While attacks of opportunity aren't super common anymore in this edition, they still come up enough that running around like a chicken with its head cut off could make you the target of a lot of them. The Guarded Movement feat is a great way to deal with that issue though, since it gives you a +4 circumstance bonus to your AC against reactions that were triggered by your movement. Basically, if someone uses an attack of opportunity on you, then their chance of wasting it dramatically increases. Even if this unfortunately doesn't stack with the circumstance bonus to raising your shield. It's still an amazing boost to your AC, and remember, your AC is probably going to be better than basically any other martial class except maybe a champion. So, really, your AC against attacks of opportunity will be absurd. PFL stance is an interesting stance that is all about using swords with the monk trait while strutting around the battlefield. It obviously requires that you have monastic weaponry, but once you're in it, the benefit is that once per round whenever you hit with a monk sword, you can then step as a free action. This is pretty incredible, as stepping someone then stepping away from them is normally a good strategy and it costs an action. Being able to do it for free is just even better. Plus, you can use this as a nice way to be able to reposition, say, step into a flank for a follow-up attack and then step away from them as your third or second action. It's a great way to set up flanks or to be used defensively, and overall it's just a great way to get some combat mobility. Sacred Key is a very specific feat, where its usefulness will depend on how much you like the alignment system and how much you're going to be fighting outsiders. You have to have a key strike to be able to take it, and you also have to follow a deity, and generally, you should only take this if your deity is not true neutral. Once you do take it, then you choose an alignment that your deity has, and whenever you cast Key Strike, you can choose to deal that type of alignment damage instead of the normal options. Also, if you ever get any other key spells that deal force damage, you can change their damage types to be whatever alignment damage you chose whenever you took this feat. My issue here is that both I am a bit iffy on alignment damage as a whole, and I also feel like this damage is very rarely better than force damage. As for alignment, I personally feel like the alignment system is pretty clunky overall, but that's, the subject of a whole different video. The main issue is that the actual damage is almost never going to be better than force damage. You only want to change the damage type on Key Strike if you're fighting against something that has a weakness to the damage type that you're changing to, because force damage is one of the best damage types in the entire game, so you really need to have a good reason to change. And generally, the only things that will have a weakness to alignment damage are going to be outsiders. So if you're fighting demons, then getting good damage is actually pretty dang great. But unless you're fighting demons or outsiders a lot, then this is a bit situational. Standstill is the monk variation of Attack of Opportunity, and it's really great at cutting down people who want to move. It triggers whenever someone within your reach uses a move action or leaves a square while using a move action. And once they do, then you can make a melee strike against them. Also, if this is a critical hit, then you disrupt their move action, stopping them early and basically forcing them to waste an action. As anyone who's been in a party with a fighter knows, Attack of Opportunity is amazing at ruining enemy plans, and always getting an extra attack without dealing with a multiple attack penalty is going to be amazing. Basically, people will have to be careful moving around you, and that is always going to be a good thing to have in a combat. Wholeness of Body requires that you already have access to key spells, but then it gives you access to the Wholeness of Body key spell in addition to increasing your focus pool by 1. Wholeness of Body is basically a souped up version of Lay on Hands, but it only ever will help yourself. It takes a single action with a verbal component, and then you either regain 8 hit points or attempt to cause a poison or disease affecting you to go away by attempting to counteract it. Also, for every single level that this gets heightened, the amount of hit points that you heal increases by 8. The healing overall is pretty good, and it will take a little while to actually catch up to Lay on Hands, but it scales faster than Lay on Hands, so eventually it will. But overall, this is just a great way to heal, because now you don't have to rely on other people to patch you up between combats, as you can just continually meditate and heal yourself over time. The real way that this shines, though, is, and the real crazy part of it, is how you can get rid of poisons and diseases. Poisons, a free chance to counteract them is going to be nice. But with diseases, you can take as much time as you need to counteract it, as many times as you need until you succeed. Basically, if you have the time, you can cast Wholeness of Body and try and counteract it. If it didn't work, you meditate for 10 minutes and try again. And then you repeat that process until it does work. You can spend a couple of hours doing this and basically take 20 on your counteract check. If you are not under a crazy time crunch, you are basically now immune to disease, which is a great boost because really, diseases are really scary in this system, so having a way to get rid of them reliably is great. Now let's move on to level 6 feats. Abundant Step requires that you have incredible movement and focus spells, meaning that it is actually impossible to get this for people who are using the multi-class archetype, as they never get incredible movement. But it is incredibly cool and a lot of fun, and if you're a little bit creative, you can get a ton of use out of it. You increase the number of focus points in your pool by 1, and you can now teleport. The spell itself is pretty simple. You then teleport up to your speed into a place that you can see. Now this might seem a little bit redundant though, since it's a one-action spell to move up to your speed. So why don't you just stride to where you want to go? Well, The reason that this is great is because you ignore anything in your path. Do you want to teleport out of a prison cell? No problem. You just have to be able to see outside of it. Don't want to bother swimming across a river? Don't worry about it. Just bamf over it like Nightcrawler. Don't want to climb a cliff like a peasant? Just teleport to the top. Teleportation is a nice ability, and being able to teleport with a key point is even better, and being able to set the range to be a monk's already insane movement speed is even better. With a little bit of creativity, this will really shine. Align Key is a reaction that requires that you have key spells, and allows for all of your key spells to slightly heal you whenever you cast them. Once per hour, whenever you cast a key spell, you can heal yourself as a reaction, an amount equal to your level plus your wisdom modifier. This is an alright amount of healing, but I do wish that it was a bit better, since whenever you compare this feat to the other level 6 feats, it's a little bit lackluster. Basically, I just wish that the amount of healing was higher, or that you could use it with more frequency, so it could be a bit more competitive with the other feats at this level. The Blazing Talon Surge feat is the first upgrade to a pre-existing stance that we've seen so far, and believe me, it is not going to be the last. Like, seriously, most other level 6 feats are upgrades to level 1 stance feats. But anyway, let's just get into it. Blazing Talon Surge is an upgrade to the Reign of Ember stance. For 2 actions, you can stride once, and if you in that stride next to someone, you can then make a Fire Talon strike against them, dealing an additional 1d4 persistent fire damage. If you hit and manage to deal damage to them, then you can also attempt to grapple them with an athletics check. This is a pretty standard way, in all honesty, to be able to spend 2 actions to get 3, and it's pretty good. I wouldn't expect a high success rate with the grapple though, since it will be made with a multiple attack penalty. Also, since it does have the flourish trait, this means that you cannot use it in the same turn as a flurry of blows. But that'd be a bad idea anyway, due to how you'd be maxing out your multiple attack penalty with at least one of either the Blazing Talon Surge or the flurry of blows. So, overall, the flourish trait doesn't matter a huge amount for most monks. Crane Flutter, shockingly, is an upgrade to the Crane stance. It's a reaction that requires that you are in Crane stance and are targeted by a melee attack by someone who you can see. You then use your arm to try and redirect their attack, increasing the +1 circumstance bonus to your AC that you get from being in Crane stance to a +3 against that attack specifically. If the attack misses you, you can then make a Crane Wing attack against them with a -2 penalty, even if they aren't within your reach. Meaning if you're fighting something that has 20-foot reach, and you use Crane Flutter and they miss, you can now punch them from 20 feet away, due to how you're manipulating their own movements. This is a really fantastic defensive reaction, as it's basically a +2 bonus to your AC, which is obviously good, and it even has some nice offensive boosts built right into it. Dragon Roar is an upgrade to Dragon Stance, and while it technically doesn't require being trained in Intimidation, you really should be at least trained in Intimidation to be able to get some use out of it. As a single action, you can bellow as you emulate a dragon's cry, potentially scaring people nearby. Enemies within a 15-foot emanation of you have to succeed at a will save versus your Intimidation DC, or they become Frightened 1 or Frightened 2 on a critical failure. Also, if a frightened creature who is frightened by the roar starts their turn next to you, they cannot reduce their frightened value below 1 on that turn. Finally, the first attack of yours that you make against a frightened creature after your roar but before the end of your next turn gets a +4 circumstance bonus on its damage roll. Once you roar, you cannot do it again for 1d4 rounds, and once someone is affected by it, then they are now immune to it for 1 minute. This is a great way to be able to work Intimidation into your action economy, as long as you don't care about trying to be quiet or stealthy. It's a great boost to your damage, and Intimidation and Demoralizing and causing Frightened are genuinely some of the most effective strategies in the game, as Frightened is a crippling condition to have. Continuing the theme of Intimidation, Gorilla Pound actually does require that you're an expert in Intimidation. And it is much more aggressive, somehow, than Dragon Roar. As a single action with the Flourish trait, you attempt to demoralize someone, and then you make a Gorilla Slam attack against them, so they have to be next to you, obviously. If you hit, then you get a bonus on the damage roll equal to triple their frightened value. This by itself is pretty dang good, as it's probably going to be between a +3 and +6 bonus on your damage roll. But if you can combine this with other effects that apply a higher frighten penalty, then this can get real nasty real quickly. Also, in addition to all that, while you're in gorilla stance, you get a 15-foot climb speed. That can simplify things quite a bit whenever you're having to climb around, so it's nice. Overall, Gorilla Pound is a great way to land a huge hit on someone, even if it does mean that you cannot use Flurry of Blows on that round. Inner Fire is an upgrade to the Stoked Flame stance, and it actually gets a purely passive benefit. While you're in Stoked Flame stance, you get cold and fire resistance equal to half your level, as your, inner fire melts cold that gets near you, and you're so used to heat that you can ignore some fire damage. Anyone who attempts an unarmed attack against you, tries to grab or grapple you, or just touches you in general, takes fire damage equal to your wisdom modifier. Unfortunately though, since they cannot take this damage more than once per round, and your wisdom modifier isn't all that high most likely, this damage will not add up all that quickly, and by high levels it won't matter all that much. The resistances are legitimately amazing though, since cold and fire are the most common types of elemental damage that you're going to be running into, so they are very nice to have. This feat that I'm about to talk about is actually from the Fist of the Ruby Phoenix AP, so if you want to avoid spoilers, then feel free to skip it. I'm not going to be talking about anything about the flavor though, or where it comes from the AP, because I don't know that. So I don't think that there's any spoilers outside of the purely mechanical ones. With that out of the way, in this stance, you loosen your joints and move with a unusual amount of fluidity, allowing you to make stinging lash attacks that deal 1d8 slashing damage with the finesse, non-lethal, reach, and unarmed traits. Yeah, you heard me right. You get access to constant reach in this stance. This is absolutely incredible, as reach is an incredible thing to have, especially if you have the stand still reaction. Additionally, you get a +2 circumstance bonus on reflex saves and checks to escape or squeeze. Overall, this is a really fun stance, even if it doesn't get any other feats that improve its effectiveness like most other stances. Alright, we've finally gotten to the first feat that is ripped straight out of Dragon Ball. If you've ever wanted to fire off a Kamehameha, which is probably anyone who has watched Dragon Ball and enjoyed it, then this is the feat for you. Whenever you get it, you increase the number of focus points that you have in your pool by 1, which is, of course, sweet, and you get the ability to cast the Ki Blast focus spell. It is actually a variable action spell, which I absolutely love those, so I'm really happy about those. And you can choose between 1 and 3 actions to put into it with different effects. Presumably, the more actions you put into it is just more time screaming out the name of the spell, if we're going by Dragon Ball logic here, but you can flavor this however you want. Eventually, I hope that there's actually a Spirit Bomb key spell that's put in that you can use multiple rounds to charge, but I'm getting beside myself here, so let's get back into the mechanics. If you spend a single action on this, then Ki Blast does 2d6 force damage in a 15-foot cone. That's alright, but if you spend 2 actions, then the damage increases to be 3d6 in a 30-foot cone. While that is way better, if you spend all 3 actions powering up, then the damage increases to 4d6 in a 60-foot cone. This is obviously better, and for every single level that it gets heightened, the damage of the 1-action version increases by 1d6, while the damage on the 3-action versions increases by 2d6. Every single person that is affected by it in the area has to make a fortitude save. On a critical success, they take no damage, and on a normal success, they take half. On a failure, they take normal damage and are pushed 5 feet away from you. And on a critical failure, they take double damage and are pushed 10 feet back. The damage here is never going to equal a actual spell slot that deals damage in an area, like, say, Fireball. But that is entirely fair, as this is a focus spell, meaning that you can keep on tossing it out over and over and over again over the course of a day. So spellcasters can't do that with Fireball, meaning that it's actually pretty dang balanced. Also, if you want to make a good use out of this, then please increase your wisdom, as Being able to have a decent spell save DC requires that you have a good wisdom. So, yeah, it's a great way for dealing with large amounts of mooks and for swarms and all that, which is something that monks are okay at, but they can always use help with area control. Mountain Stronghold is an upgrade to Mountain Stance, and it makes it even better. For a single action, you can now get a +2 circumstance bonus to your AC by calling on your connection to the earth. Well, that's good and all, you could just get the exact same benefit by just buying a shield. The real power of this feat, though, is the passive benefit, as now, whenever you enter Mountain Stance, you increase the dexterity modifier cap to your AC by 1, so now it is 1 instead of 0. This means that you can actually have a +1 dexterity modifier and have it help out your AC. And by this point, if you are in a Mountain Stance and you have a +1 dexterity modifier, you will have the highest AC possible that a monk can have. And the only way that a dexterity monk, which are generally the more defensive monks, can match it is at level 10 whenever they get a +5 dexterity modifier. Basically, you get a lot tankier from this alone. So being able to take this and making sure that you have a +1 dexterity modifier by level 6 means that you can be as tanky as a monk can get for this level. One-Inch Punch lives up to its name, and it's basically just a better version of Power Attack while also being a bit more flexible. For 2 actions, you can make an unarmed attack, and if you hit, you deal an additional weapon damage die of damage. If you spend 3 actions for it, though, and you hit, then you deal an additional 2 weapon damage die. Once you hit level 10, the number of damage dice double, and once you hit level 18, then they triple, meaning that if you spend 3 actions to use One-Inch Punch and hit at level 18, then you deal an additional 6 weapon damage dice. If you want to make the most out of this feat, then I really recommend grabbing it whenever you have a stance that has a large weapon damage die, like, say, the Dragon stance with its D10 Dragon Tail attack. Generally, adding, say, 6 additional D10s is a lot more than adding 6 additional D4s. So basically, the larger weapon damage die that you have, the better that it is, especially if that attack does not have the Agile trait. If it does have the Agile trait, then it's probably just going to be better to use a Flurry of Blows for fewer actions, and that'll do more damage. Basically, if this was on any other class, this would be insanely good. But it's on the monk, and it has to compete with Flurry of Blows, which pretty much nothing in the game can beat Flurry of Blows. But it's still a pretty good feat for whenever you need to get one really big hit in. Return Fire is actually an upgrade to both the Monastic Archer stance and the Deflect Arrow suite. Now whenever you successfully deflect an arrow, as part of that reaction, you can make a bow strike against anyone by firing that arrow back towards your enemies. Despite the name of this feat, you can actually make this attack towards anyone, not just the person that attacked you. And being able to get additional attacks is always going to be incredible. Also, due to how you're a ranged character, you're probably a bit more likely to actually get shot by another ranged character, as, you know, you're gonna be at range, so you're more likely to get shot. Overall, this really improves Monastic Archer and the Deflect Arrows feat. So, I really like the way that this works. Stumbling Feint upgrades the Stumbling stance so long as you are an expert in Deception. Now whenever you use Flurry of Blows while in Stumbling stance, you start with a weak move before starting a dangerous combination of attacks. When you use Flurry of Blows, you can attempt to feint as a free action before the first attack. If you succeed, then instead of making them flat-footed against you for only your next attack, they are flat-footed against both of the attacks in the Flurry of Blows. This is absolutely insanely good. Like, what's better than spending one action and then getting 2 strikes? Spending one action and basically getting 4 actions, being able to do this pretty much every single turn. Seriously, this is basically getting a feint, then getting an attack, then getting another feint, and then getting another attack all for one action. This is insanely, absurdly good. Partially because it's just upgrading Flurry of Blows, which is already an action that you're probably going to be using every single turn anyway. Like, This is probably the best stance upgrade in the entire system. It's really, really fun and I really enjoy it. Tiger Slash is an alright boost to your damage, and it's rather similar to One-Inch Punch and does suffer from some of the same issues. For 2 actions, you make a Tiger Claw Strike. It deals 2 extra weapon damage dice, though this does increase to 3 extra weapon damage dice at level 14, and you then push the target 5 feet away from you. Also, if your attack was a critical success, then you add your strength modifier to the persistent bleed damage that is caused by your Tiger Claw attack. Unfortunately, I'm not that big of a fan of this. Dealing an extra 2 or 3 weapon damage dice isn't all that great when you are using an agile unarmed attack that will be doing more damage if you just attack twice with it. Basically, this would be good on other classes, but having Flurry of Blows makes it pretty bad. Just, like One-Inch Punch. Also, adding your strength modifier to the bleed damage doesn't make it all that much better by this level. Creatures are probably going to have over 100 hit points by now, so an extra 2 or 4 damage isn't going to be game-changing. The ability to push them back is pretty good though, since if you're right next to a cliff then it can be helpful, but it's still a little bit situational. Water Step is a very situational feat, though there are going to be some uses for it. You can now stride across liquids or other surfaces that wouldn't normally support your weight. This only lasts during your movement though, so you have to end your movement on terrain that can support you, or you will fall through it or just fall into the water or whatever. Basically, it'll work like normal if you stand on it, but you can walk across it just fine. Being able to literally walk on water, or fragile surfaces, or run across a bunch of leaves in a canopy that cannot support your weight is cool and all, but it is very situational, and I wish that this improved itself at later levels, like some skill feats do. Like, I wish that, let's say, at 15th level, if you had this feat, you could now stand on water. I don't think that that would be that crazy powerful, but I think it would be an upgrade to an already situational feat. Plus, I just want to be able to have a fist fight while on the top of a tsunami, man. Is that too much to ask? I've actually talked before about the Whirling Throw feat during my video on the Wrestler archetype, and let's talk about it some more then. This is probably my favorite feat in the entire game from both a fun perspective and an optimization and effectiveness perspective. If you're going to be grappling people frequently, which, if you're thinking about taking this feat, then you probably are, then it's a great tool for your toolset. For a single action, while you have someone grabbed or restrained, you can make an athletics check against their fortitude DC, getting a penalty if they're larger than you and getting a bonus if they're smaller. If you succeed, then you throw them 10 plus 5 times your strength modifier, and they take bludgeoning damage equal to your strength modifier plus 1d6 per 10 feet that they flew. If you critically succeed on the check, then they land prone, and if they fail, then you don't throw them at all, and if you critically fail, then they are no longer grabbed or restrained. The reason why I love this feat so much is because this isn't an attack, meaning that it doesn't suffer from a multiple attack penalty if you do it after grabbing someone. If someone is near death, and you have them grabbed, you can just throw them to try and finish them off, and if it doesn't finish them off, then they have to spend an action to approach you again, forcing them to use their actions to get back into the fight. This is great, and even a great thing to do to, someone who is not near death. Also, I find that there is nothing more fun in the game than grabbing someone and trying to whirling throw an enemy off of a cliff, or into a conveniently placed wall of fire, or a prismatic wall, or basically any effect that will horrifically mess up someone if you toss them into it. Just yelling bullseye as you yeet someone across the battlefield is never not going to be fun, and it kind of feels bad for the poor soul that you're doing it to, but it's still really fun. Wolf Drag is an upgrade to the Wolf Stance, and is honestly terrifying. For 2 actions, you make a Wolf Jaw Strike, and it gets the fatal 1d12 trait for this attack. Basically, it means that if you critically hit, then you're just going to be leaving behind a cloud of red and mist, since fatal d12 attacks are horrifically effective. Also, if you succeed on the hit, then they are automatically knocked prone. Being able to automatically knock someone prone for 2 actions on hitting someone is actually something that can also be done by fighters, but for them it requires being 10th level and 2 feats, and one of those feats is made completely redundant by the second one. Also, for them, spending those 2 feats to be able to knock someone down for 2 actions is a good investment, and you can do this at level 6 and not level 10. I said before that Wolf style itself is a bit lacking in flair and overall, cool factor, but Wolf Drag does make it an incredibly scary option once you get to level 6. Arrow Snatching is a direct upgrade to the Deflect Arrows reaction. Now, whenever you successfully deflect an attack with it, you can immediately make a ranged attack against the person who attacked you by throwing their projectile back at them. This is a thrown weapon with the same range increment as the original attack, and it deals all the exact same effects to them as it would have to you. So it does all the same damage. If it's poisoned, it poisons them, yada yada yada. Basically, they just target themselves with their own attack based on your attack roll. This is a pretty alright ability, but I do think that it's a bit too situational for general use most of the time, due to how this only affects physical ranged attacks, and how it will only actually be useful if you're in a fight where there are physical ranged attacks. Basically, if you know that you're going to be fighting a lot of spellcasters, then this is not nearly as useful, and a lot of the time, creatures are better at fighting in melee, so they're going to be trying to fight in melee. Just in my experience, there are going to be a lot of situations where this is not super useful, so it's up to you to determine whether or not you think it fits both your character and the campaign that you're in. The Clinging Shadows Initiate feat is one of the only stance feats that requires key spells to get and a focus point to enter the stance. Whenever you take this feat, you increase your focus pool by 1, and you get to spend an action to enter the Clinging Shadows stance, which takes 1 key and basically turns your key into a sticky smoke-like substance that saps life. While you're in this stance, you can make Shadow Grasp strikes that deal 1d4 negative damage that have the Agile, Grapple, Reach, and Unarmed traits. Also, while you're in this stance, you get a +2 circumstance bonus on athletics checks to grapple and to the DC for any creature that is trying to escape from your grasp. The damage type being negative is actually alright most of the time, since if something is alive, it can't be damaged by negative energy. But if you're fighting undead, it is legitimately useless as they cannot be damaged by this attack. But you're not taking this for the damage, really, because the best part of this feat is the bonuses to grappling. Having reach and grapple on the strikes means that you can grapple someone while being 10 feet away from them, and the bonuses on top of the rolls and DCs is incredible at keeping them contained. Now they're going to have to spend an action to try and escape, and probably another action to get close to you. This stance really excels at wrapping people up and keeping them locked into position, and it does really fulfill the role of probably the best grapple stance for a monk. The Iron Blood stance is a pretty amazing stance, especially for people that are using weaponry that are not attracted to any of the other stances that use weaponry. This stance is all about not yielding to any blows and emulating iron, and it allows for you to make Iron Sweep unarmed attacks that deal 1d8 bludgeoning damage with the non-lethal parry, sweep, and unarmed traits. Also, while in Iron Blood stance, you get resistance to all damage. At 13th level, 16th level, and 20th level, this resistance increases by 1. While this resistance isn't really all that high, it does apply to literally any kind of damage that you take, meaning that this will add up pretty quickly over the course of a campaign of how much damage you're actually reducing. Also, you are not limited to making Iron Sweep attacks. You can make any type of attack that you want, which is why this works really well for weapon monks. Generally, if you're looking for a defensive stance, then Iron Blood stance is very good. Mixed Maneuver is a pretty nice feat for monks who want to grapple, shove, and trip opponents frequently, though it will often get in the way of being able to deal damage, since it will reduce your multiple attack penalty quite a bit. To take it, you have to be a master in athletics, which is probably pretty easy for someone who wants to be grappling, tripping, and shoving often. And then for 2 actions, you can choose 2 out of grapple, shove, or trip to perform. You then attempt both of those attacks at the same or different creatures, but you don't increase your multiple attack penalty until after both checks. Being able to grapple someone and trip them for 2 actions without a penalty on either roll is incredible and really increases how likely you are to succeed. And grappling and tripping the same person will really eat into their action economy. The issue that you're going to be running into is where if you use mixed maneuvers on a turn, you probably don't want to be using Flurry of Blows on that turn due to how at least either Flurry of Blows or mixed maneuvers will be used at maximum multiple attack penalty, which basically means it's not going to do much. So generally, if you use mixed maneuvers, you're not going to be using Flurry of Blows and vice versa. So you're basically giving up your ability to deal damage on a turn to take away an enemy's actions and just restrict their options. Basically, I think that mixed maneuvers works great if you're fighting a smaller amount of enemies, as then reducing their amount of actions is much more substantial than, say, grappling and tripping one of 20 zombies that you're fighting. If you're fighting a boss, mixed maneuvers can be amazing, but if you're fighting a swarm of different low-level creatures, it's not nearly as good. Pinning Fire is an upgrade to the Monastic Archer stance, but it can also really help the Shooting Star stance. As a free action, whenever you use Flurry of Blows to attack the same person twice with a ranged piercing weapon, you can try and pin their clothing to restrict their movement. If you hit with both attacks, then they have to succeed at a reflex save against your class DC, or be immobilized until they or someone else succeeds at a DC 10 athletics check to pull out the projectiles from their body. If it makes no sense that this would work, like if you're shooting a ghost or a gelatinous cube or something else that would basically be impossible to pin, then this doesn't work. Just use common sense. This is a pretty useful effect, but how useful it is does depend on what kind of action it is to pull out the projectile. Rules as written just purely based on what is in the text of the feat, this has no action involved and it is not going to be very useful. However, I feel like it is highly likely that this is meant to be a single interact action, as the critical specialization for bows has the exact same effect, except it specifies that it's in one interact action to attempt the check. So I am 99% certain that you're supposed to have to spend an action to make the DC 10 athletics check. They are almost certainly going to succeed and remove their immobilized condition, because this is a DC 10 and it's a level 8 feat, but it still is eating their actions, which is always going to be useful. Reflecting Spin is a great offensive reaction that upgrades the Reflecting Ripple stance. It triggers whenever someone hits you with a physical melee attack, whenever they are within your reach and you can see them. Once the attack resolves, you can then immediately step, though you still have to be within the opponent's reach. Once that is done, you can then attempt an athletics check to either disarm or trip the person who attacked you. If you've watched my videos on the athletics skill, then you know that I'd generally be recommending you to try and trip here, as basically to get results that matter on a disarm check, you have to critically succeed, while trip is far simpler and is a lot more likely to work and eat up an action and leave them flat-footed. This is an amazing ability though, since being able to trip as a reaction once per turn whenever you get hit is exceptionally frustrating to fight against. The Tangled Forest stance feat is a bit of a weird stance feat that is all about restricting enemy mobility, which by itself, just purely taken by itself, is a little bit lackluster, but with a little bit of investment and making sure that you put a lot into it, then it can actually get really annoying for your enemies to deal with, which is exactly what you're looking for. While you're in this stance, you can make Lashing Branch unarmed attacks that deal 1d8 slashing damage and have the Agile, Finesse, Non-Lethal, and Unarmed traits. Additionally, and here's the big thing, while you're in this stance and can act, any enemy that is within your reach that tries to move away from you has to succeed at a reflex save, acrobatic check, or athletics check against your class DC, or be immobilized for that action specifically. Basically, you interpose whenever people try and get past you, or whenever they try and run away from you. Just that alone is a little bit lackluster though, but it can get a lot better. If you get a reach weapon, then the area in which your reach expands to is significantly larger, and it'll get a lot harder for people to get away from you, because this just applies to your reach, not your reach with unarmed attacks. So basically getting a reach weapon extends the area in which people have trouble running away from you in. If you get enlarged, then that increases the area even further, especially if you're also using a reach weapon still. You don't actually have to use the reach weapon to attack. That is the interesting thing here. You just have to use it to reduce and annoy enemies' movements. Basically, this stance works amazingly if you're maximizing your reach, as then you can be a real pain for enemies and can better protect the backline spellcasters who are much more squishy than you. Wall Run is one of those feats that whenever you use it, literally everybody knows that you're a monk. For a single action, you manage to defy gravity and run up along vertical surfaces. You stride up to your speed so long as you start out on a horizontal surface, and during this movement, you can run up walls at your full speed. If you end off of the ground, then you immediately fall after your next action or whenever your turn ends. This means that you can run up a wall and flurry of blows someone, but you'll fall immediately afterwards, but it'll be really cool whenever you do it. Speaking of being cool as hell, if you have the water step feat or something similar, you can now run up flimsy or liquid surfaces like waterfalls. Also, the mental image of a monk running up a flagpole and then across the flag itself cracks me up, because technically, with water step you can do that. The issue that this feat faces is similar to water step, in that it solves very specific problems, and there are generally more effective solutions that are easier to get. Wall Run can help you out a bit with flying enemies, but only if they are next to a wall. At this level, you can probably get access to magical flight from your spellcaster friends, which is basically better in every single way because it doesn't require that you're next to a wall, and you can stay up there for a longer period of time. Also, if you're just using this to get up on top of a cliff or get on top of a building, you could just get a grappling hook. I feel that this needs to be better. I feel like what this feat needs to be better is for you to not automatically fall at the end of your turn, and to allow further wall running after your first action. I don't care if that ability comes at a later level, or like at 15th level you can just walk on walls at 24/7. I think that would be a really fun feat that wouldn't be all that, overpowered compared to the kind of spells that spellcasters can start tossing out. I'm all for buffing the weird kind of out there feats that don't give much of a mechanical benefit that are just cool. If something is cool, I want it to be very good at what it does and what makes it cool. The Wild Winds Initiate feat is similar to the Clinging Shadows Initiate feat in that it is a stance feat that requires key spells to get and a focus point to enter. Also, just like Clinging Shadows, it gives you an additional focus point. Where Clinging Shadows stance was based around grappling though, the Wild Wind stance is all about ranged attacks. While you're in it, you can make Wind Crash unarmed attacks with a while in it, you can make Wind Crash unarmed attacks as ranged strikes against targets within 30 feet. Basically, you punch into the air, and the air carries the force of your punch to another target. It is incredibly anime. These strikes deal 1d6 bludgeoning damage and have the agile, non-lethal, propulsive, and unarmed traits. Also, they ignore all concealment and all cover. The propulsive trait here means that you get half of your strength modifier to your damage rolls, and the ability to ignore concealment and cover is absolutely insanely good for a ranged attack. Also, while you're in this stance, you get a +2 circumstance bonus to your AC against all kinds of ranged attacks. This stance is probably the go-to stance for a key monk, since being able to use one focus point and get the benefits for the rest of the combat is a great boost to a key monk's effectiveness, and can help not put you in melee nearly as often. Let's move on to level 10 feats. The Blazing Streak feat is yet another improvement to the Stoked Flame stance. For 3 actions, while you're in Stoked Flame stance, you can stride twice, making an attack against up to 4 different creatures that you got near to during your movement. Any flashing spark strikes that you make during this deal fire damage instead of slashing damage. This is a pretty nice boost to your mobility and the ability to deal damage on the move, but the two issues that I'm seeing with this is that one, your multiple attack penalty will keep on increasing, making the later attacks a lot less effective, and secondly, you're going to be spreading around the damage a lot. Basically, yeah, your multiple attack penalty will be rocketing up pretty quickly, and your further attacks will not be very accurate at all, and secondly, yeah, you can only make one strike against each creature if I'm reading this correctly, meaning that you're going to be spreading around the damage a lot rather than making a lot of attacks against a single target, which is generally how a monk does a lot of their damage. So it's up to you whether or not you think that this is worth it. Cobra and Venom is an improvement to the Cobra stance, and it can only be used once per minute, but it's still really good. For a single action while you're in Cobra stance, you make a Cobra Frang strike with an additional 5-foot range to it. If it hits a target, they take an additional 1d4 persistent poison damage per weapon damage die on the attack. This is a pretty alright amount of persistent poison damage, but it is going to be running into the same issue as normal Cobra Frang strikes, where poison is a common damage type for creatures to have resistance or immunity to. The second benefit of this stance, though, is quite a bit more generally useful and is, really insanely good. If you have this feat and are in Cobra stance, which is almost assuredly true, then you increase the circumstance bonus to your Fortitude and Fortitude DCs from a +1 to a +2 circumstance bonus. Getting a flat +2 to all Fortitude saves and to your Fortitude DC is insanely good, and will be making up for not being able to do quite as much damage to particular types of enemies. This is insanely good and will help you out throughout your entire career with this character. This feat is another one from the Fist of the Ruby Phoenix AP, so if you want to avoid spoilers then skip ahead, but I won't be talking about any story spoilers here, since I don't know them. Okay, so now that that's out of the way, Entwined Energy Key is an uncommon feat that allows for you to deal either acid, cold, fire, or sonic damage with a bunch of your key spells. Whenever you pick this feat, you have to choose one of those damage types, and now you're stuck with it. Whenever you cast Key Blast, you can change the damage type to that type of damage, and whenever you cast Key Form or Key Strike, you add this damage type to the ones that you could normally choose from. My issue with this feat is that it's basically inferior to the Elemental Fist feat from level 2 in almost every single way, since Elemental Fist doesn't lock you into a single type of damage, and it can also be applied to key spells other than Key Strike. Basically, it's worse than a level 2 feat, which is a pretty bad thing for a level 10 feat to have. Knockback Strike takes 2 actions, and for some reason it has the Concentrate trait. But whenever you do use it, you make an unarmed attack, and if you hit, you can attempt an athletics check to shove the target, using the same multiple attack penalty as your strike. This is pretty good in all honesty, but I just wish that by this level, it had a guaranteed effect rather than requiring the athletics check. Fighters have improved knockdown by this point, which allows them to knock someone down without needing an athletics check, so I feel like monks should just be able to shove people without the athletics check part. This can certainly be useful, but you'll have to go out of your way to make the most out of this. Although I am going to point out that if your GM really likes putting environmental hazards all over the place in combat, then this gets way better, since using this to shove someone off of a cliff is way better use of the actions. P-Foul Strut is an interesting feat that improves P-Foul stance, and it works amazingly if you aren't the primary part of the front line. Basically, for one action with the Flourish trait, you can step twice, then strike with a Monk Sword. Being able to get 3 actions for the price of 1 is always good, and if you hit, then you can immediately take another step due to the effects of P-Foul stance. This can be a great way to approach an enemy, hit them, and then step away from them, forcing them to use their actions to approach you. Essentially, this is an amazing feat for hit-and-run tactics, but it isn't as useful if you're going to be playing more defensively and, you have to always stay between, the enemies and the squishy wizard at the back. If that's your role in a party, this is not as good. But if you can be a hit-and-run, sort of go in, come out, sort of all over the place sort of fighter, then this is actually really good. Prevailing Position is an interesting reaction that requires that you are currently in a stance and activates whenever you are targeted by an attack or a reflex save against a damaging effect. Upon triggering the reaction, you immediately exit your stance and lose all of its benefits, but you get a +4 circumstance bonus to your AC or reflex save against the attack. Depending on the stance and situation that you're in, this can be a huge boost to your survivability. While you're going to have to spend an action to get back into your stance if it's a critical part of your game plan, that is better than bleeding out on the floor. There are some stances though that I generally don't think that this is very good, such as crane stance and mountain stance, as well as any of the stances that require a focus point to enter. The key stances are pretty obvious here, as it wastes a focus point to, exit them, but crane stance and mountain stance are already boosting your defenses, meaning that exiting them will make you a lot more vulnerable to further attacks. For crane stance, if it's an attack, then you could just be using crane flutter, which gives a +3 circumstance bonus to your AC, which is just barely lower than the +4 from prevailing position. When it comes to mountain stance, using prevailing position is actually actively worse, since if you leave mountain stance, you're losing all of your item bonus to your AC that you get from it, which is essentially meaning that if you use prevailing position, your AC is not going to change for the attack that triggered it, and it will be a lot lower for any future attacks. Basically, for crane stance and mountain stance, prevailing position is not very good. For almost every other stance, it is very, very useful to have in your back pocket. The sleeper hold feat makes a monk's grapple far, far, far more scary than it has any right to be. As a single action, while you have someone grabbed or restrained, you can attempt to pinch vital points on them to mess up their nervous system. You make an athletics check to grapple them, and then if you succeed, they are clumsy 1 until the end of their next turn. If you critically succeed, though, then they fall unconscious for 1 minute and remain standing and holding onto whatever they were holding. This does have the incapacitation trait, meaning that you're not going to be able to do this to higher level people, but still it is absolutely horrifying. There are 2 main ways that I can see making this feat really, really strong. First is having ways to re-roll this action. The most obvious, in my mind, way to do this is to be able to cast True Strike beforehand, but hero points will also work. The wildest option in my mind, especially since this is a monk guide, is a gymnast swashbuckler taking the monk multiclass archetype and grabbing sleeper hold at level 20 with the daring do feat, then they could roll twice and take the better on every single time that they use this check, considering that they are in panache. But, of course, this is a monk guide, so you can kind of ignore that. The second way to improve the odds of success with sleeper hold is to improve grappling as a whole. This is a grapple action, meaning that stances like Clinging Shadows will improve its effectiveness. Also, make sure you have a good athletics, and try to avoid doing this when you have a multiple attack penalty, but really, being able to spend 1 action and just to try and take a grappled target out of a fight is incredibly good. Wind Jump is probably the best key spell in this entire class, since getting a fly speed is the best way to deal with flying enemies for almost every single monk. You're able to manipulate the air around you, giving you access to the Wind Jump focus spell, and increasing your focus pool by 1. Whenever you cast this 1-action verbal spell, you get a fly speed equal to your land speed, though you do have to end your turn on solid ground or you immediately fall. This little issue does get resolved pretty quickly though, since once this gets heightened to 6th level, once you hit level 11, then at the end of your turn, you can attempt a DC 30 acrobatics check to find purchase in mid-air, stopping you from falling. While DC 30 is a bit high, if you are a master in acrobatics and have a good dexterity, Winding Flow is a simple action that can only be used once per round, and it gives you another way to be the fastest class in the game by giving you even more action compression. Once per round as an action, you can take 2 actions from either the stand, step, or stride actions, but you can only use one of those actions once. So this is like a step and a stride, or standing up with one of the other 2 actions. You can't use this to stride twice. This is situationally useful, since a lot of the time you might not actually need to stride or stand in a turn. It is pretty good whenever you need it though, even if that is a little bit rare. This is yet another feat from the Ruby Phoenix AP, and it's also the last level 10 feat. If you want to avoid any spoilers, then skip ahead to level 12, but there are not going to be any mentions of, like, actual, story spoilers here, so I think you'll be safe. Now that that's done, whenever you take this feat, you can cast Wrong Monk's Wrath as a key spell, and increase your number of focus points by 1. This is another variable action spell, so let's break it down. For one action, you can deal 2d6 force damage and 2d12 electricity damage in a 5-foot emanation around you. If you use 2 actions, then the emanation increases to a 10-foot emanation, and the damage is now 3d6 force damage and 3d12 electricity damage. For a whole 3 actions, the emanation becomes 20 feet, and the damage is now 4d6 force damage and 4d12 electricity damage. Anyone affected by this gets 1 basic reflex save against both types of damage, and on a failed save, they are deafened for a round. On a critical failure, they also take 2d12 persistent electricity damage and are deafened for a whole minute. Every 2 levels that this gets heightened, the force damage increases by 1d6, and the electricity damage increases by 1d12. But if you use additional actions, then the damage increases by 2 dice instead of 1 for every 2 levels that it gets heightened. This is an interesting alternative to Ki Blast for dealing with large amounts of enemies that are spread out over an area. But Wrong Monk's Wrath has the downside that it's a lot harder to aim, and it still affects all of your allies. So if your allies are in the area, then you could very well be hitting them as well. Overall, it's a pretty nice ability, but I feel like it's a little bit too indiscriminate for my personal tastes. The Diamond Soul feat is a rather simple feat that manages to pack a very big punch. Due to how you've managed to fortify your body and mind, you get a flat +1 status bonus to any saving throw against any magical effect. By level 12, you're going to be running into magic constantly, so getting a constant bonus to all of your saving throws against magic is incredibly good. A +1 is pretty nice, especially since this is going to be applying to probably around half or more of your saving throws. Essentially, this is going to add up substantially over the course of a campaign. The Disrupt Key feat is a pretty nice way to be able to mess up living creatures, and it's a nice way to be able to consistently apply persistent negative damage. For 2 actions, make an unarmed strike, and if you hit and deal damage, then you mess up their internal functions. They take 2d6 persistent negative damage, and while they are taking this damage, they are enfeebled 1. When you hit level 18, then this damage increases by 1d6, so it's a total of 3d6 persistent negative damage. The negative damage itself is pretty good, but it will not be very useful at all if you're fighting undead, since they cannot be damaged by negative damage. The enfeebled effect is pretty good, because applying a penalty, even if it isn't a big one, is going to be pretty nice, and because you can do this as many times per day as you want, if you open up against a big bruiser sort of character with this, then it might affect them for maybe 2 or 3 rounds where they have a penalty on all of their strength-based checks. It can be pretty useful, though it is maybe a little bit situational due to how undead and constructs are very, very common things to fight. Dodging Roll is a great defensive reaction that triggers when you take damage from an area effect that allows a reflex save, and it also requires that you're a master in acrobatics to be able to take the feat in the first place. Whenever you use this reaction, you dodge a bit more at the last moment, taking a step and getting resistance to all of the damage that you take equal to your level. Also, if your step takes you outside of the triggering effects area, so out of the burst of a fireball, as an example, you increase the resistance by your dexterity modifier. This is a pretty nice defensive boost, but it is a little bit weird to me. Like, overall, this is great resistance. But the actual resistance itself and the whole design of the feat is a little weird, because this requires that you're a master in acrobatics, and effectively improves your reflex saves, which kind of implies that it's going to be better for monks that focus on dexterity, because it's a dexterity-based skill and a dexterity-based save. The issue is that if you are a monk that focuses on dexterity, then your reflex saves are going to be amazing if you improve them with Path to Perfection. Like, you're not going to be taking damage on a reflex save unless you fail or critically fail, which isn't going to be all too likely if you have a good dexterity and a good proficiency on your reflex save. So essentially, this is a reaction that you can only use if you fail or critically fail on what is likely your best save. This means that this is actually a lot better, I feel, for strength monks that probably won't have nearly as good of a reflex save, but it will require that you're a master in acrobatics to be able to take it. So I feel like this is a good reason to increase your acrobatics on basically any monk, and it's almost like dexterity monks get diminishing returns for taking it, even though it still does work pretty well for them. A free step and a large amount of resistance is great for basically anyone. Focus Shot is another upgrade for the monastic archer stance, and it is pretty nice even if it is a little bit situational. It's not too situational to not make it good though. For one action, you calm yourself down and focus entirely on one shot. You then make a ranged weapon strike against someone in your first range increment, ignoring the target's concealed condition and all cover that they have from you. This is pretty sweet for ranged characters, since if you're at range, you are much more likely to be dealing with cover and concealment. Basically, if you're shooting through an ally, they get cover. This allows you to ignore that, and if you don't have any other way to do it, then this is incredibly nice. Concealment is also a real pain, so being able to ignore it is very nice. Sometimes you just need to land one accurate hit, and in those situations, this could be better than a flurry of blows. Yeah, a flurry of blows is 2 attacks, but if you have to deal with concealment and cover on both shots, then you're probably going to have a higher likelihood of doing damage with Focus Shot. Improved Knockback is a huge boost to the shove action, and it basically makes it twice as effective. Whenever you shove someone, you now increase how far you can push them and how far you can follow them by 5 feet on a success, or by 10 feet if you critically succeed. Basically, you can now push people 10 feet on a success, or 20 feet on a critical success. Also, if you do manage to shove them into an obstacle, they take 6 bludgeoning damage plus your strength modifier, and if you become legendary in athletics, they increase the damage by 2. This damage is not all that good by this level, but the increased distance you can shove people is amazing if your GM likes putting in environmental obstacles. Falling damage is not going to be all that lethal by the time that you are fighting anyone at level 12, but it is still going to be useful for pushing someone down a cliff, because they're going to have to spend a bunch of turns getting back up, which will give you some more time to prepare for them. Also, shoving someone 10 or 20 feet away means that they have to approach you using their own actions. So if you have Stand Still or an Attack of Opportunity in reach, they have to run up to you and you can just smack them. You can also just use this to get people away from squishier casters, which is always going to be useful and your casters will appreciate it. Meditative Focus is almost a required feat if you want to use key spells consistently in combat. Whenever you refocus out of combat, if you've spent at least 2 focus points since the last time that you refocused, you get 2 back instead of 1. In case you didn't know, normally you can only get back 1 focus point every time that you refocus, and you can refocus if you haven't spent a focus point since the last time that you did it. So, if you have 2 max focus points in your pool, and you spend both of them, you cannot get back up to having 2 focus points until you rest. Basically, this almost doubles the amount of focus points that you can spend over the course of the day, because now you can spend more than 1 without having to worry about limiting your functionality in a future combat. So now you can start throwing out key strikes and key blasts, no problem, without having to worry about not being able to enter, say, any stances that require a key, or running into a situation where it might be a bit more relevant to use a focus point then. This basically vastly improves the amount of key spells that you can cast, and it is genuinely amazing for a key monk. Overwhelming Breath is an interesting feat that can improve some key spells, but it has a pretty limited effectiveness. For a single action, you improve the next key spell that you cast, so long as it is, the next thing that you do. If the key spell has no duration, the spell and any strikes that you make as part of it ignore an amount of physical damage resistance equal to your level. Physical damage resistance isn't all that common though, So it is a bit situational, especially since the only spell that this actually improves is Key Strike, since it is the only monk spell that has a duration of instantaneous and that does physical damage. So it is a little bit weird that this is basically just a pure upgrade to Key Strike, but Key Strike is pretty good and it'll help you with dealing physical damage resistance. So it's alright, and it does what it does pretty well, but it is still fairly situational. This is another feat from the Fists of the Ruby Phoenix AP, but I won't be talking about the story at all, so if you're looking to avoid story spoilers, you should be fine. Anyways, if you have the key spells, you can take this feat, and you get the ability to sense the presence of life around you. This is literally imprecise life sense with a range of 30 feet. This is pretty dang useful since there are hardly any effects that allow you to get around life sense. It can help pinpoint what square someone is in. This is a pretty nice and general way to be able to deal with invisible creatures or just in general things that are trying to hide from you. And it's just a cool ability. It's being able to sense the life force of other people, which is just a fun, neat ability. Stance Savant is a pretty great feat, though how effective it will be depends a lot on the style that you tend to use. As a free action, whenever you roll initiative, you can now enter a stance. This will be saving you around 1 action per combat, but it's a bit more useful for defensive stances. Essentially, stances like Crane Stance, Mountain Stance, and Ironblood Stance give you great bonuses to your defensive abilities, so getting their benefits in case you get a lower initiative than the enemies is really nice. Especially for Mountain Stance, having a much lower AC before your first turn in a combat can be very dangerous, so being able to get around it is great. Also, this is going to be good for pretty much every monk because it'll save them a bit of actions, and almost all monks are going to be, in a stance, so Stance Savant will help them get in there faster and be able to do more on their first turn. Wave Spiral is another boost to the Reflecting Ripple stance, and this time you can use it to try and trip a whole bunch of people. Once a minute for 2 actions, you can attempt an athletics check to try and trip anyone standing on the ground in a 10-foot emanation of you. These attempts do increase your multiple attack penalty, but it doesn't actually increase until you've made all of the attempts. While you do this, a whirlpool of water swirls out and rips people off of their feet. While this is probably only gonna come into effect once a combat, unless you're in a very long combat, a group trip is an amazing tool to have in your tool set, even though this will target allies, so do be careful about that and try and use this when you aren't near your allies. Explosive Death Drop is one of the best names for any feat in this entire system, and I will not hear otherwise. It's basically just a super over-the-top wrestling move. It's the final boost to the Reign of Embers stance, and it requires that you have the Blazing Talon Surge feat to be able to take this one. For a single action while you are in the Reign of Embers stance, and you have someone grabbed or restrained, you lift your foe into the air and crash them back down to the ground, causing a fiery explosion. Yeah, you're just, causing an explosion whenever you suplex someone. You roll an athletics check against their fortitude DC, taking a penalty if they're larger than you, and getting a bonus on your athletics check if they are smaller than you. If you critically succeed, then they take 12d6 fire damage from the explosion and fall prone and are no longer grabbed. Also, the target and anyone next to them takes 1d6 persistent fire damage. While technically this does include you, because you're probably going to be next to them, the fire resistance that you get from being in the Reign of Ember stance is going to be high enough by this point that you can't actually be hurt by a measly 1d6 fire damage. If you only succeed on the athletics check, then you deal 66 fire damage to them, and they fall prone and are not grabbed. If you fail, then you just lose the grab with no other effects, and if you critically fail, then you fall prone. This is so incredibly over the top, and I love it, and it works really well with the Blazing Talon Surge feat for running up to someone, hitting them, then grappling them, then, lifting them up into the air and exploding them into the ground. The damage isn't all that huge, actually, but it's so incredibly cool that I genuinely can't get myself to care too much about it being a little bit lackluster whenever it's this fun. Formlock is an incredibly situational feat that the wrestler archetype also got access to, but it is insanely situational. For a single action, whenever you have someone grabbed or restrained, you can make an athletics check to counteract a polymorph effect that the target is under. Once you make this check, then they are then immune to further attempts for a full day. Honestly, I don't know really where this would be useful often enough to justify using your 14th level feat to be able to do this, even if the mental image of someone squeezing the polymorph out of an individual is amazing. Ironblood Surge is an improvement to the Ironblood stance, improving its defenses slightly. For a single action while you're in Ironblood stance, you get the benefits of Iron Sweep's parry trait, getting a +1 circumstance bonus to your AC. Additionally, your resistance from Ironblood stance increases to your strength modifier if your strength modifier is actually higher than the normal damage resistance that you get. This is a pretty alright feat, and spending an action to get a +1 bonus to AC is pretty good, but increasing your damage resistance by 1 or 2 isn't going to be all that crazy unless you get hit a hell of a lot from a bunch of different attacks during that turn. If you know that you're going to be in a situation like that, then yeah, this is pretty good. But otherwise, it's a little bit lackluster. Mountain Quake is the final boost to Mountain Stance, and for once it actually gives you an actual offensive ability. While you're in Mountain Stance with this feat, the dexterity cap of your AC is +2 now rather than +1. This is a great boost because it's pretty much a constant +1 to your AC as long as you're in Mountain Stance, so long as you have a +2 dexterity modifier. If you do have a +2 dexterity modifier, then you'll have an equal AC to a champion in heavy armor. Basically, this is the best AC that a monk can get access to. Additionally, for a single action, you can stomp on the ground, dealing damage equal to your strength modifier to everyone within a 20-foot emanation of you. They do get the ability to resist this damage though, with a basic fortitude save, but it has the added effect of if they fail on that check, then they fall prone. Once you use this, you can't use it again for 1d4 rounds, but it's still pretty great. Yeah, the damage is terrible, but the ability to knock a bunch of people prone every once in a while is incredible because now they're going to have to spend actions to get up. Additionally, this doesn't increase your multiple attack penalty because it's not an attack. Though I will warn you to be careful about this because this will affect your allies. So if your allies are nearby, maybe don't do this or try and move to an area where it's safe to use. Also, it won't be helpful if you're ever fighting something in the sky. The Shadow's Web feat is actually an improvement to the Clinging Shadows Initiate stance, though it doesn't actually require that you're in the stance to be able to use it. Whenever you take this feat, you increase the amount that you have in your focus pool by 1, and for 2 actions, you can now cast the Shadow's Web focus spell. Whenever you do, darkness surges from you in a 30-foot burst, dealing 14d4 negative damage to everyone inside. Additionally, everyone has to make a fortitude save. On a critical success, literally nothing happens to them. If they normally succeed, then they take half damage and are enfeebled for 1 round. If they fail, then they take full damage and are enfeebled 2 for 1 round. And if they critically fail, their day is absolutely ruined. They take double damage, are stunned 1, enfeebled 2 for a round, and are also immobilized for a round or until they escape. Also, every single level that this gets heightened, the damage increases by 2d4. This is a great way to deal damage in a large area, even though it does, target your allies, and if you are fighting a lot of undead, then this won't do much to them. Undead will still suffer from the secondary effects, but it still isn't ideal. This is another great way to be able to deal with a large amount of enemies in an area, which is, again, something that monks often will struggle with. So getting a large-scale AoE and crowd control effect is very, very good. And again, you don't actually have to be in the Clinging Shadows stance to be able to use this focus spell, so you can use this anytime that you want. Tangled Forest Rake is an improvement to the Tangled Forest stance, which isn't all that surprising, and it isn't all that crazy for a 14th level feat, but it's still pretty good. For a single action, you make a Lashing Branch strike. And if you hit and deal damage, then you can move the target 5 feet to anywhere that is still within your reach. Moving people around while doing damage is pretty useful, but by this level there are probably going to be a lot of effects that you can use to move people around, so it's up to you whether or not you want to spend your feet on this. It's still pretty good, and if you're in the Tangled Forest stance, you're probably going to have a pretty good reach, so being able to move people around will be nice. Timeless Body is one of those feats that I understand why it's at this level for its mechanical benefits, but its secondary, more RP sort of benefits, I am shocked that this is at such a low level. Whenever you take this feat, you stop aging. Yeah, you just stop aging, meaning that you are only ever going to die from more violent means rather than old age. You are basically immortal now. In more mechanical terms, you also get a +2 status bonus on all saving throws made against poisons and diseases, and you also get poison resistance equal to half your level. The bonuses against poisons and diseases is great and all, but getting to play a character that is now immortal is such a fun idea that I honestly feel like it's the main draw for this feat. Tongue of the Sun and Moon is a very, very situational feat. You can now speak and understand all spoken languages. This is pretty dang good, but the issue that you're going to be running into is that a lot of monks aren't going to be the party's face. And if you have spellcasters in the party, then casting Comprehend Languages is a pretty easy thing by 14th level. Tongues is also an appropriate thing to cast, and basically, yeah, there are going to be a lot of ways to learn languages by this point, and taking a whole feat that only gives you the ability to speak these languages and understand them, and not read anything, is going to be a bit more situational. Basically, if this allowed you to read anything that was written down, it would be a lot better, but as it is so incredibly situational. Whirling Blade Stance is incredibly cool, and I just wish that it was a lower level feat. Whenever you enter this stance, you manipulate monk weapons with ki. Any monk melee weapons that have the finesse trait also now get the thrown trait with a range of 10 feet. When you make a thrown strike with a weapon with the, that is qualifies, then the weapon can keep on going. It now stays in the square that you throwed it to, and you can make additional strikes with it, with the source of the attack coming from its square rather than your square. At the end of your turn, it then flies back directly to you and you can catch it. So you can throw it at someone 10 feet away, and then throw it again from that square 10 feet away from you to someone else within 10 feet of that, the weapon, and just keep on going, then it'll come back to you. The issue that I have with this is that at high levels, a thrown weapon with a 10-foot range is super, super low range. If this was 20 feet, or 30 feet, or further, then this would be a lot better, but as it is, you're not going to be throwing this very far at all. I wish that this was a lower level stance, and there was a higher level feat that could upgrade it to have, say, a 30-foot range, or a higher range on the weapon. This is such a cool stance, and I just wish it had a bit more mechanical bite to be able to match its flavor. The Wild Winds Gust feat is an amazing upgrade to the Wild Winds Initiate stance. For 2 actions, you shoot out a huge gust of air. You can then make wind crash strikes against every creature in either your choice of a 30-foot cone or a 60-foot line. All of these attacks do count for your multiple attack penalty, but it doesn't increase until after all of the attacks. This is an insane amount of utility, and it gives a reliable way to deal with a large amount of enemies, which is something that monks generally lack. Being able to hit 3 or 4 people in this area is an incredible way to deal damage to a bunch of people, and the best part, the cherry on top, is that you don't hit all of your allies with this. Most abilities that monks get to deal with large amounts of people end up hitting all of their allies, but not with Wild Winds Gust. Basically, this is a really, really just incredible action that you can use, even if you can only use it in the Wild Winds Initiate stance. This is another feat from the Fist of the Ruby Phoenix AP, so skip ahead if you want to be avoiding spoilers. Anyway, Electric Counter is an improvement to the Wild Wind stance, so we're getting two of those back to back, and it gives people a great incentive to not attack you. This is a reaction that you can trigger whenever you take damage. Whenever you do this, you get electricity resistance equal to your level, and if the damage you took was electricity damage, then you get this resistance against that. This resistance only lasts until the beginning of your next turn, though, so it is very short-lived. If the triggering damage was from a melee attack, though, then you also deal 3d6 electricity damage to the attacker, and they get no save to reduce this. This is pretty alright, though it's mainly useful if you're dealing with a lot of enemies that deal electricity damage. Unfortunately, electricity damage is one of the less common elemental damage types, so I don't know how often that will really happen. Dealing damage to the people that hit you is generally a lot more useful, since if you're in the Wild Wind stance, you probably don't want people to be close to you because it's a ranged stance. Giving people a reason to avoid hitting you will help keep them at a distance. Enlightened Presence is a very, very nice feat that is very simple, that makes you and your allies much more resistant on basically every will save. It doesn't actually apply to every will save, but it's a very common effect for will saves to have. You are now so resolved and assured that you and all allies within 15 feet get a +2 status bonus on will saves against mental effects. Now, the important thing to keep in mind is that pretty much all of the important abilities that require will saves are probably going to be mental effects. Will saves are generally representative of your ability to resist people to manipulate your mind, or to resist orders, or all of that. So getting a constant +2 bonus to most of the party is an amazing boost to your whole group's defenses. Especially now that at high levels, enchantment spells are starting to get really, really scary. Nobody wants to get mind controlled, and now you can help out with that. You know how I said that the knockback strike feat was a bit underwhelming? Well, Flinging Blow is basically just an upgraded version of that feat. For 2 actions, you attack someone with an unarmed strike, and if you hit, then they have to make a fortitude save versus your class DC. On a fail, they get shoved 10 feet back, or 20 feet on a critical failure. If you knock the target into an object or another creature, then both the target and the obstacle that they hit take 1d6 bludgeoning damage per 5 feet that they didn't get moved. The damage is alright if they critically fail and if they aren't moved at all, but it doesn't really amount to all that much, considering that they have to fail to even move at all in the first place, and by, level 16, 1d6 to 4d6 damage isn't a really huge amount. This is a great way to control enemy positioning, though, since you can just start knocking people around all over the place. But it is important to keep in mind that by this level, you could just be legendary in athletics and be shoving people around, which would get about the same effect even if there isn't the damage involved. The Master of Many Styles feat is a kind of weird feat, with only a few uses that you'll be using frequently. It allows you to, as a free action, whenever your turn starts, to enter a stance. And you have to have the Stance Savant feat to be able to take this. Basically, you can enter a stance every turn without having to spend any actions. This feat is clearly intended for monks who use multiple different stances, and to swap between them to whatever is more appropriate for the moment. My issue here is twofold. First, most characters are not going to have more than one stance that they can use in the first place, since in general it's a bit more incentivized to pick a kind of stance that you specialize in. You don't get all that many class feats, so most monks are just going to have one stance. Secondly, even if you do have more than one stance that you can use, most encounters can be dealt with one stance. It's kind of designed that way. Let's say that you have both Crane stance and Cobra stance, and you realize that you're fighting against poison resistance enemies. Then you could use this feat to switch into Crane stance, but there isn't all that much of a reason to switch into Cobra stance at all during the fight, because Crane stance will be able to deal with it just fine. Also, if you're realizing that you're fighting against poison-resistant enemies, and you don't have another stance and you just have Cobra stance, you could just not go into a stance and just fight them normally. Most styles can be used in a variety of different situations, and you can make it work. The one great use for this feat, though, is if you combine it with the prevailing position feat. If you leave your stance by increasing your defenses with prevailing position, then you can just get back into your stance at the beginning of your turn with, Master of Many Styles, basically removing the downside of prevailing position. Basically, now you can just have a reaction that gives you a +4 bonus to AC, and then you can just get right back into that stance that you normally use at the beginning of your turn. This still isn't ideal for something like Mountain Stance, but it's great for a lot of others. Medusa's Wrath is a terrifying focus spell that allows you to literally turn people into stone just like a Medusa. Whenever you take this feat, you improve your focus pool by 1 if you weren't already at a maximum of 3. Whenever you cast Medusa's Wrath as 2 actions, you make an unarmed attack. On a success, the target is slowed 1, and on a critical success, they are slowed 2. At the end of their turn, they can make a Fortitude save versus your spell DC. This save does have the incapacitation trait. If they succeed at the Fortitude save, then their slow condition decreases by 1 to a minimum of 0, and if their slowed condition reaches 0, then the spell ends. If they fail on the save, then their slowed condition increases by 1, or by 2 on a critical failure. If this ever completely removes their ability to act on a turn, probably by hitting a slowed 3, then they are now petrified permanently. While it isn't all that likely to actually petrify creatures above your level, turning people into stone is always going to be an effective strategy since it permanently removes them from the fight. Also, removing actions from your enemy is always going to be a positive. 1mm Punch is an upgrade to 1-inch Punch, and it allows you to send people flying. Now whenever you hit someone with 1-inch Punch, they must make a Fortitude save versus your class DC. On a critical success, nothing happens, but if they just get a normal success, then they're pushed 5 feet back. If they fail, then that distance is doubled to 10 feet, and if they critically fail, then the distance is increased even further, moving them 10 feet per action that you spend on 1-inch Punch, which basically just means either 20 or 30 feet. Unless the target critically succeeds, then they're going to have to spend an action to get back into melee, which is always going to be good, so long as if that is where the enemy actually wants to be. Additionally, if they, fail or critically fail, then they're going to have to spend a full stride to get back, meaning that if you have something like Stand Still and Reach, or if an ally has Attack of Opportunity and Reach, then they are probably going to provoke getting back into melee. Using this is going to be pretty good, so long as you happen to like using 1-inch Punch. And also, this only happens whenever you want, so if you don't want to shove someone away, then you don't have to. Overall, if you use 1-inch Punch a lot and you like it, then this is a great upgrade, though if you don't use it very much, then it's just highly situational. Quivering Palm is the only save or die spell that a monk gets access to, and as expected from a save or die spell, it's scary as all hell. For 2 actions, you make an unarmed strike against someone. So long as you hit them and they are alive, any time in the next month you can speak a word of death as a single action. No matter where the target of the spell is, when you speak the word, they have to make a Fortitude save that is affected by the incapacitation trait against your spell DC. On a critical success, they survive and take no damage or effect, and the spell ends and are immune to further Quivering Palms for 24 hours. On a success, they instantly take 40 damage and are stunned 1, though the spell does still end and they are also immune to it for 24 hours. If they fail, then they are stunned 3 and take 80 damage. Also, the spell continues, then they cannot be killed by Quivering Palm for the next 24 hours. Technically, this only excludes them from the critical failure effect, meaning that you can still deal damage to them so long as the damage doesn't actually kill them. Speaking of the critical failure effect though, if they do critically fail on their saving throw, they instantly die. For each level that this spell gets heightened, the damage increases by 10 or by 5 if they get a success. Additionally, if you cast this, you instantly lose the effect of any other Quivering Palms that you currently have active. This is great to have in your back pocket for whenever you need it, since being able to potentially instantly kill someone is very, very good. Also, just for GMs out there, this is a very fun ability to give to it, like a NPC or a villain, because it makes for amazing blackmail material. For example, a NPC that the party cares about is being held hostage or at least is being blackmailed by a villain, using Quivering Palm on them and threatening to just instantly snap their fingers and give them a heart attack if they don't give in to their commands. It's a really interesting ability that kind of sets up for a lot of interesting situations, and it works very well as a sort of blackmail material for a villain to have. It's still great for a PC. Shattering Strike is a feat that is all about punching around your target's defenses, or, from another point of view, just punching so hard that their defenses don't even matter. For 2 actions, you make an unarmed attack, bypassing all of the target's resistances. This includes physical resistances and also like resistances to energy damage or basically anything else. It doesn't bypass immunities though, meaning that you still can't punch a fire elemental with fire if it's straight up immune to fire. Also, if you're striking a target that has hardness, then you have the hardness for the purposes of calculating your damage. This is an alright ability, but by this point, monks have 3 different class features that help them get around damage reduction, so it's a little bit weird that you would have to take a feat to be able to bypass it entirely. This is okay, but it's only okay if you're having a consistent issue where you're running across resistance that you cannot get around. So it's a bit weird, although if you're fighting a bunch of constructs who have hardness, it could be useful. At level 18, the Diamond Fist's feat is all about increasing your damage. Whenever you take it, your fists start building up momentum as you attack, potentially increasing your damage by a ton. All of your unarmed strikes get the Forceful trait, and any that already have it increase their damage die by 1 step. For those of you who don't know, Forceful gives you a circumstance bonus to your damage rolls equal to the number of damage dice on your second attack of the turn, and double that for any further attacks, and those are weapon damage die, not just any type of damage die. This is, by this level, is basically just a +4 on your second attack of the turn, and a +8 on any further attacks. Normally it is impossible, by design of the system, to get Forceful on an agile weapon, due to how getting more accurate and more damaging iterative attacks is insanely good. If there was an actual weapon that had both traits, it would probably be one of the best weapons in the entire game, so they don't just give that to anyone. Getting this as an 18th level feat is incredible, and it can really boost your damage output pretty well. I would say that generally this is good if you have an agile weapon, and alright if you already have a forceful unarmed attack, but I wouldn't say that it's particularly worth taking an 18th level feat to apply Forceful to a non-agile weapon. This is another feat from the Fists of the Ruby Phoenix AP, so if you want to avoid spoilers, then you can skip ahead. I have no idea what happens to AP though, so I can't exactly give you story spoilers. This is a very simple feat. It allows you to channel energy through your limbs, giving you reach on all of your unarmed attacks. This is super simple, and obviously amazing. Having reach is always going to be better than not having reach after all. And it really improves any reactions that you have that allow you to hit people for moving, like say standstill or attack of opportunity. Empty Body is a key spell that will basically allow you to astral project, except you bring your body with you. If you take it, you increase your focus pool if you aren't already at your maximum, and then for 2 actions, you can spend a focus point to cast Ethereal Jaunt. And this version of Ethereal Jaunt does not actually require you to concentrate and sustain it. Ethereal Jaunt makes you ethereal for a minute and allows you to drift around the material plane without being affected by literally anything on it. You still can be attacked by force effects and you still get stopped by force effects, but you can just drift through everything else. This means that you can just drift through walls, go basically anywhere that you want as long as it hasn't been protected against this. Also, keep in mind that by 18th level, there's a pretty good chance that you're going to be exploring planes outside of the material plane. And if you are doing that, you literally cannot cast Ethereal Jaunt if you're not on the material plane. So it is a little bit something where you just need to keep that in mind. This is incredibly good though, as Ethereal Jaunt is a wonderful spell for both scouting and just general maneuverability. But it's also great as a great get out of jail free card, both in the literal sense of getting out of jail and also if you're in a very dangerous situation and you just need to leave, you can just turn ethereal and walk away. Key Center is basically an upgrade to the Master of Many Styles feat, but is specifically designed for monks who use the Clinging Shadow stance or the Wild Wind stance. Also, it does help out with any future stances that they put out that also benefit from Key Center and cost focus points to enter. Once per minute as a free action, you can cast a single action key spell that has the stance trait, but you don't actually spend the focus point. This means that so long as it's been at least a minute since the last time that you used this, you can't get caught without being able to enter a stance of your choice. So you don't have to worry about using a focus point and using up all of your focus points to enter into your key-based stances, and then getting immediately jumped after the combat ends before you can refocus, and then not being able to do your signature thing. This is going to be very, very nice, since it basically means that you can also use another, key spell every single combat, since you don't have to use it to enter your stance now. This is very, very good if you use the Clinging Shadow stance or the Wild Wind stance. And, of course, for anyone else, it is terrible. Earlier on, I said that the Wrong Monk's Breath and the Key Blast spells were some of the most anime abilities in all of Pathfinder 2e. Keyform is the one ability that tops them both, as it literally just gives you the ability to go Super Saiyan. For 2 actions with the verbal component, you draw out your inner power, polymorphing yourself into a more powerful form. While you do this, all of your hair or other cosmetic markings like feathers or scales begin to glow into a color of your choice, and you get the ability to fly at, the same speed as your land speed. Since you're a monk, this means that you're going to be a very, very fast flyer. Also, you choose either force, lawful, if you're lawful, positive, or negative damage whenever you cast this spell. All attacks that you make deal an additional 1d6 damage of that type. Also, you literally glow. In a 5-foot emanation around you, you have an aura with the light trait, and anyone that begins their turn in this corona takes 2d6 damage of the type that you add on to all of your strikes. Also, as a single action, you can increase this effect out to 30 feet instead of 5 feet, which means that you can deal a lot of damage to a bunch of people in an area. Also, this is a light effect, meaning that it will attempt to counteract any darkness effects that it runs into, and while this can only happen once per day per effect, this is still a great way to just walk into a dark room and literally blast it away with your soul. There are some downsides to this spell though, since basically you're letting your emotions run you at the moment, meaning that you're a bit more susceptible to emotional effects. This mechanically comes into play by taking a -2 status penalty on all saves versus emotion effects, though in part due to how your emotions are running you, you are a bit more resistant to anything that tries to manipulate your mind that doesn't affect your emotions, giving you a +2 status bonus on those mental effects. The other benefit is because you're basically going off of an emotional rush currently, you can't pull your attacks, meaning that all of the attacks that you get lose the non-lethal trait, meaning that you cannot try and take someone alive with this spell active. This is an amazingly fun spell, and it's also pretty good on top of that. Getting a fly speed and a damage boost is nice, and emotion effects aren't all that common, so getting a penalty to them is not the end of the world. Also, who doesn't just want to go Super Saiyan every once in a while? Meditative Wellspring is another improvement for the Meditative Focus feat, allowing you to recover 3 focus points whenever you refocus rather than 1 or 2. This further improves the amount of key spells that you can cast in each combat, and it's basically the go-to feat for monks who use key spells at this level if they don't use key stances. Seriously, you can cast a ton more focus spells if you recover all of them between combats. Swift River is a great ability that allows you to emulate water, flowing around anything that tries to restrain you. As a free action whenever your turn ends and you either have a status penalty to your speed, are immobilized, or you're slowed, you just end one of those effects. This is pretty stupidly good, since those effects are fairly common, since, If you're ending the immobilized condition, then you're probably removing the thing that makes you immobilized, like the grabbed or restrained condition, and those are especially really common. You're going to be an absolute nightmare to keep locked up, or to keep still, or even just to slow you down and try and divert your attention from a particular direction. Also, any creatures whose game plan is based around grabbing is going to have a very bad time when fighting you, since you literally cannot be grabbed for more than 6 seconds. Triangle Shot is the final upgrade to the monastic archer stance, and it's a doozy. It requires that you have, the monastic archer stance and stunning fist, which is a pretty safe assumption. And then for 2 actions, you can fire 3 arrows all at once. You make 3 ranged strikes against a single target at your current multiple attack penalty, though you do take a -2 penalty on all of these attacks. This does count as 2 attacks for calculating your multiple attack penalty, but I'm kinda doubting that you're going to be making more attacks after this anyway. If any of those attacks hit, then they are affected by Stunning Fist, despite how this isn't actually a flurry of blows. Also, if all 3 attacks hit, then you deal 3d6 persistent bleed damage. This is basically a slightly higher risk, higher reward version of Flurry of Blows. Flurry of Blows has the benefits of being 1 action, but it does have the penalty of your second attack being at a -5, since no bows have the Agile trait. This is a bit more interesting since it's 3 attacks for 2 actions, but all of your attacks take a -2 penalty and no multiple attack penalty. It's a bit of a trade-off, but sometimes you just really need to turn someone into a pincushion, and this is one of the best ways in the entire game to turn someone into a pincushion. If you have the actions to do this, then it is a very, very good use of 2 actions. Let's start off level 20 feats with a bit of a low point, since I think that Deadly Strikes is one of the more disappointing level 20 monk feats. Essentially, your unarmed strikes are a lot more dangerous now, gaining the 1d10 deadly trait, or increasing their deadly dice to 1d10 already. This is a bit underwhelming, since while the deadly trait does add a fair amount of damage to critical hits, I'd take the Diamond Strikes feat over this. Essentially, this is a alright feat, just not at level 20. Surprisingly enough, this feat is not actually from Fist of the Ruby Phoenix. Instead, it's from the Extinction Curse AP. So if you want to avoid spoilers, then skip ahead a bit. The Endurance of the Rooted Tree feat requires that you have Wholeness of Body, and it allows you to cast the Wholeness of Body spell as a free action at the start of all of your turns, though it still does cost a focus point. Additionally, you no longer need to eat, drink, or breathe, as you're able to sustain your stealth no matter what environment that you're in. This is an alright effect, but it's a bit mechanically dull for level 20. I would prefer it if it gave you fast healing, or if it allowed you to, say, ignore the focus point cost of Wholeness of Body, say, 2 times a minute. I feel like that would have been a very interesting feat that still vastly improved Wholeness of Body, but it didn't, say, use up all of your focus points just to heal yourself. I am a bit more harsh with level 20 feats, if you can't tell. I feel like they should be really special and stand out. Enduring Quickness is the monk's version of the level 20 feat that every single martial class gets that makes them permanently quickened. In the monk's case, this additional action that you get can only be used for striding and leaping, or for one of the actions that's required for high jump or long jump. This is a bit underwhelming, to be honest, since due to your movement speed, you might not actually need that additional action all that often, since you are going to be about twice as fast as everyone else in the party, meaning that you can probably get into melee with a single stride. Also, if you are up close to people, and you're taking that additional stride every turn to, say, get into a flank or to help someone else get a flank, this means that you're a lot more likely to actually provoke reactions. It's okay, but like I said earlier, I'm a bit harsher on level 20 feats, since they should stand out and feel unique. And this honestly doesn't. I would be a lot more positive about this feat if you could also use it to make a flurry of blows. Fuse Stance is an interesting feat that really you have to build for in mind from level 1. To take it, you have to have at least 2 stance feats, and once you take this feat, you can now combine them into a new stance of your own design. Whenever you enter this stance for a single action, you get the benefits and drawbacks of its 2 different parent stances. Also, you cannot combine 2 stances that have overlapping restrictions. So if they both restrict you to a particular type of unarmed attack, you cannot combine them. Combining a defensive stance with an offensive stance is a great way to shore up any weaknesses that you might have. Also, Ironblood stance is a great option to combine with basically anything, because it doesn't have any requirements for you, and it also gives you constant resistance to all sorts of damage. I'm also just going to point out here that combining the Mountain stance with the Ironblood stance will just make you so annoying to kill. This time, this is a feat from the Age of Ashes AP, so if you want to avoid spoilers for it, then skip ahead. Who knew that there were a bunch of level 20 feats from APs? Anyways, if you take Golden Body, then you literally perfect your body and function without flaw. Your unarmed attacks get the deadly D12 trait, making criticals absolutely brutal if you hit. Also, you get fast healing 20 so long as your HP is not 0. This can make you insanely hard to put down permanently, as you'll just constantly heal from all wounds. Overall, it's a super fun and flexible feat that will fit up just about anyone. And in case you were curious as to why you can just get Deadly D12 whenever that just makes it objectively better than the Deadly Strikes trait, this has the Uncommon trait, meaning that most people are not going to have access to this. Impossible Technique is a widely applicable feat, and it is insanely good. As a reaction, whenever someone hits you or you fail a saving throw, you perform an action that is technically impossible. To wrap your head around the kind of impossible stuff that we're talking about here, imagine someone dodging an attack after it has already hit them. Like, somehow you manage to just break reality for a second. There's a reason why this is a level 20 feat. If the triggering effect was an attack hitting you, then you force the enemy to roll again and take the lower result. If you failed on a saving throw and that was the triggering effect, then you get to roll again and take the higher result. This is amazingly good. Not only does it make you drastically harder to actually hurt, it can never make the situation worse like a lot of reroll abilities can. Every single turn, you can use this, and it will make a nightmare out of anyone trying to hit you. The final feat I'm going to be talking about is from the Fist of the Ruby Phoenix AP, so if you don't want to hear about it, then you can skip to my final thoughts. This is actually a stance, and it's certainly a scary one. You get the ability to attack the pressure points of people's souls, getting the ability to make Vitality Blast unarmed attacks. These are ranged strikes that have a range of 30 feet that deal 1d4 negative damage, but they also have the versatile positive trait, meaning that you can still fight undead. Also, if you use the Stunning Fist feat while you're in the Vitality Manipulating stance, you can apply a different set of effects to their Fortitude save, although you have to do this before they actually roll and know their result. If they critically succeed on their Fortitude save, then of course nothing happens. But if they just succeed, then their muscles temporarily become weaker. For 1 round, they are enfeebled too, and anytime that they try and use a manipulate action, that action is disrupted unless they succeed at a flat check with a DC of 5 plus their enfeebled value. This is generally just going to be, a DC 7 flat check, but if you have any other allies that have the ability to force people to be enfeebled, then it works really well for them. If they fail on their save, then it functions exactly as a success, except that the duration is 1 minute instead of 1 round. If they critically fail, then again, it functions like the success, except the duration is 1 minute. But the flat check now increases to be DC 11, and the target takes a 10-foot penalty to all of their speeds for the duration, so a full minute. This is generally pretty good, since being able to make people enfeebled is going to be reducing people's damage output and accuracy for some enemies. But I will just point out here that this will not be nearly as good against dexterity-focused martial enemies or spellcasters. The mental image of someone manipulating raw life force is metal as hell though, so it gets bonus points for just being that cool alone. It's a pretty nice stance, although I don't know how you would get to level 20 without having a stance and game plan in mind already. Overall, I really love monk feats. That should be pretty obvious by this point. They are super versatile and can manage to be pretty well balanced. I think that the only feat that is universally the best for its level is Stunning Fist, and basically every other level is evenly matched. Also, I really love how they manage to make every single monk unique. A lot of other classes have sort of feat chains that lead to, oh, well, if you take this feat, then you're obviously going to be taking this feat. But monks don't really fall into that trap at all, which is really wonderful. Due to the way that you can combine stances with all of these different types of feats, every single monk is probably going to have a pretty unique playstyle. Also, I really love how they did stances in this system. They are not required at all, even if they do make your monk a lot more effective, but they aren't hard to use and they don't overcomplicate things. It's just a single action and then you get a couple of benefits. You don't have to use them, even if they are very nice. So I just really like the way that they were implemented when compared to, say, Pathfinder 1e. I don't think there is all that much else for me to talk about though, since I've already been talking for over 2 hours at this point, so I think you get most of my opinions on the monk by this point. So, yeah, thanks for watching this video. This has been one hell of an undertaking, as you can probably tell, and boy am I happy that it's done. I didn't really grasp the full scale of this video before I started, but I'm pretty happy with how it turned out. The next couple of videos are probably going to be a bit on the shorter side though, to give my wrists a break, because God, there's a lot of typing involved in this. Also, I am a bit sorry if the audio does change in quality or volume over the course of the video, because I've recorded this over the course of a week and a half, and during that week and a half, I've changed where I'm recording and how I'm doing it, so it might not be the most consistent, but I'll try and keep it consistent going forward in future videos. It's been a hectic time for me. Anyways, I'd love to hear what you guys think about the video in particular, and about the monk class as a whole. Any constructive criticism would be really appreciated in a comment down below, and it'd help me improve my videos going forward and just learn more about the system. Also, if you could like or subscribe down below, that would also be appreciated since, I want this channel to get bigger, and I want more people to be able to see it, and for it to get better, and liking, subscribing, and commenting are the best ways for that to happen. Anyways, until I see you next, live a wonderful life.